Richard smiled as if this were any other birthday breakfast. He folded his hands on the dining table, glanced at the wrapped presents waiting in the living room, and said in a calm, measured voice, "Emma, we need to discuss your inheritance." My stomach dropped. For months I'd been dreading those exact words, not because I didn't expect them, but because I knew what they probably meant. Across from me, my stepfather looked completely relaxed. He had that familiar expression he always wore before making a decision for everyone else in the house. My mom poured coffee, unaware of the tension settling over the room. Then Richard reached beside his chair and placed a thick manila folder on the table. "I've spent a lot of time preparing this," he said with a reassuring smile. "It's important that we handle your father's money responsibly." He thought he had perfect timing. What he didn't know was that less than 12 hours earlier, every single dollar of my inheritance had legally become untouchable. I kept my face perfectly still. If he found out too soon, everything I'd feared for weeks would finally come into the open. The night before my 21st birthday, while everyone assumed I was out celebrating with friends, I had quietly driven across town to meet an attorney. The appointment had been arranged in secret. Not even my mother knew. For weeks I'd been noticing things that didn't feel right. Richard had started bringing up my inheritance far too often. At first it sounded casual. "So when do you finally get access to your dad's money?" Later it became more specific. "You know, family wealth should benefit the whole family." Then came the comments that lingered in my mind long after he walked away. "Someone your age shouldn't be making financial decisions alone." Every conversation ended the same way, with him volunteering to help manage everything. I never accused him of anything. Richard had been in my life since I was 9 years old. He paid the bills, handled every financial decision in our house, and spoke with the quiet confidence of someone who expected to be obeyed. Confrontation had never come easily to me, so instead of arguing, I started paying attention. The more I watched, the more uncomfortable I became. When I suggested meeting with a financial advisor after my birthday, Richard laughed. "You don't need strangers filling your head with complicated advice." When I mentioned hiring my own attorney to explain my father's estate, he frowned. "Lawyers only complicate family matters." Every answer pointed me back to him. Eventually, I stopped asking questions out loud. Instead, I made one phone call he didn't know about. The attorney handling my father's estate reviewed every document with me. He explained my legal options, answered questions Richard had always brushed aside, and described a way to permanently protect the inheritance if I wanted complete independence over it. An irrevocable trust. Once the assets were transferred, no amount of pressure, persuasion, or family influence could reverse it. The decision terrified me. If my suspicions were wrong, I'd be acting against someone who insisted he only wanted to help. If they were right, I couldn't afford to wait another day. So I signed. By the time I drove home that evening, every dollar my father had left for my future was legally secured exactly as I wanted it. I slept only a few hours. Now, on the morning of my birthday, Richard sat across from me believing everything was unfolding according to his plan. He leaned forward and gently pushed the folder closer. "Managing an inheritance is a huge responsibility," he said. "At 21, that's a lot for anyone. I've already organized everything so you won't have to worry." I looked down at the paperwork but didn't touch it. Richard's smile never faded. "I've already prepared everything you need to sign." I rested my hands in my lap instead of reaching for the folder. "I'd like to read everything first," I said. For a split second, Richard's smile tightened. It was almost too quick to notice, but I had spent years learning to recognize the tiny cracks in his calm exterior. "Of course," he replied smoothly. "I'm just trying to save you the trouble. Legal documents can be overwhelming." "I still want to read them." His fingers tapped lightly against the table before he pulled the folder back a few inches. "There's really nothing complicated here, Emma. I've already spoken with professionals. Everything has been arranged with your best interests in mind." My mother looked between us, sensing the tension. "Richard's only trying to help," she said gently. He's handled our finances for years. He doesn't want you making an expensive mistake. I forced a small nod. I know, but inside, I couldn't stop comparing her confidence to everything I'd noticed over the past several months. Whenever I mentioned speaking with an independent financial advisor, Richard had dismissed the idea. You don't need someone charging ridiculous fees to tell you obvious things, he'd say. When I asked whether I should have my own attorney explain my father's estate documents, he had answered even faster. Lawyers love creating problems that don't exist, keep family matters inside the family. At the time, those comments had sounded practical. Now they felt carefully calculated. Later that afternoon, while everyone prepared for the birthday gathering downstairs, I slipped into my bedroom and unlocked the small wooden box my father had left for me years earlier. Inside were old birthday cards, photographs, and copies of estate papers I'd rarely looked at. One folded letter caught my attention. It wasn't long. My father had written it shortly before he died, knowing I wouldn't read it until I was older. Most of it was personal, filled with encouragement and memories. Then one paragraph stopped me cold. When you're old enough to receive what I've left you, remember that it's yours alone. Never let anyone convince you that protecting your future is selfish. Make your own decisions, and don't surrender that responsibility to someone else. I read the words again, and then a third time. The language suddenly felt less like fatherly advice and more like a warning. A floorboard creaked outside my bedroom. Before I could tuck the letter away, the door opened. Richard stood in the doorway with an easy smile that didn't quite reach his eyes. There you are, he said. Everyone's waiting. His gaze drifted toward the papers in my hands before returning to my face. Still looking through all that old paperwork, I quietly folded the letter shut. One question refused to leave my mind. Why was Richard so determined to keep anyone else from looking at my father's estate documents? By early evening, the house was full. My grandparents, 2 aunts and uncle, and several cousins had gathered to celebrate my 21st birthday. Laughter drifted through the living room, wrapping paper covered the floor beneath the gifts, and my mother carried out a homemade cake. For a few minutes, everything almost felt normal. Then Richard stood and tapped his glass with a spoon. I'd like to say a few words. The room quieted. He placed a hand on my shoulder, smiling proudly. When I married Emma's mother, I promised I'd look after this family. Watching Emma grow into a young woman has been one of the greatest privileges of my life. Several relatives nodded. And today, he continued, she's reaching another important milestone. Her father wanted her future to be secure, and I've spent years making sure she would be prepared to manage that responsibility. He looked directly at me. In fact, Emma is about to make a very responsible financial decision today. My heart sank. He hadn't even asked me privately again. Instead, he was using my entire family as an audience. Richard reached for the same manila folder from breakfast and set it on the coffee table where everyone could see it. I've already had the paperwork prepared, he said. Once Emma signs, we can put this behind us and enjoy the rest of the evening. Several relatives smiled, assuming this had all been planned together. I stayed seated. I'm not signing anything. The room fell silent. Richard chuckled softly, as though I were joking. Emma, now isn't the time to be nervous. I'm not nervous. Then let's finish this. I said no. The smile slowly disappeared from his face. You're making this harder than it needs to be. One of my aunts shifted uncomfortably in her chair, while my mother looked confused. Richard sighed dramatically. I know you're excited about having access to all that money, but large inheritances require maturity. That's why I've taken the time to organize everything for you. His tone was gentle. His words weren't. Every sentence suggested I couldn't be trusted to make decisions for myself. I looked around the room before asking the question that had been bothering me all day. If this is my decision, why were all the legal documents prepared before you ever asked whether I agreed? No one spoke. Richard answered a little too quickly. I was simply being efficient. But efficient for who? I asked. He opened his mouth, then hesitated. For the first time that day, he didn't have an immediate answer. My uncle frowned. I was actually wondering the same thing. Richard laughed awkwardly. Everyone's reading too much into this. Before he could steer the conversation elsewhere, my cousin Daniel spoke up. Now that you mention it, he said, looking at Richard, didn't you tell me last month that things were finally going to work themselves out after Emma's birthday? Richard turned toward him. I never said that. You did, Daniel replied. We were at Grandpa's barbecue. You said you'd been carrying a financial burden for years, but once Emma turned 21, there'd finally be some breathing room. The room grew noticeably quieter. Every pair of eyes shifted back to Richard. He cleared his throat. You're remembering it wrong. Daniel shrugged. I don't think I am. Richard immediately changed the subject. Tonight is supposed to be about Emma. Let's stop discussing finances in front of everyone. Until that moment, he'd been the one insisting we discuss them. The contradiction hung in the air. His confidence, so steady at breakfast, had begun to crack. I slowly stood. I actually did make a legal decision about my inheritance. Every head turned toward me. Richard stared without blinking. What decision? He asked. I met his eyes but gave nothing away. I'll explain when the time is right. The color drained from his face. The room stayed silent for several long seconds. Richard recovered first. Emma, he said with a strained smile, let's step into my office. We don't need to involve everyone in private financial matters. I didn't move. No. His smile faded again. This is a family issue. Exactly, I replied. That's why I'd rather everyone stay here. Several relatives exchanged uneasy glances. My mother looked back and forth between us, clearly unsure what was happening. Richard lowered his voice. You're making a mistake. I've already made my decision. He reached into his pocket, pulled out his phone and stepped a few feet away. I watched him dial a number with hurried fingers. When the call connected, he turned his back to the room. Hi, he said, forcing a calm tone. It's Richard, we're ready to complete the paperwork. A pause. His shoulders stiffened. What do you mean? Another pause. He slowly turned to look at me. No, that's not possible. The attorney's voice wasn't loud enough for the rest of us to hear, but Richard's side of the conversation said enough. When? His face lost all color. Who authorized that? Another silence. I understand. He lowered the phone without another word. Everyone in the room was staring at him. Finally, my uncle broke the silence. Richard, what's going on? He looked directly at me. You transferred the inheritance. I nodded. Last night. His jaw tightened. You had no right to do that without discussing it with this family. It was my inheritance, I answered evenly. The decision was mine. Richard shook his head in disbelief. You don't even understand what you've done. I understand it perfectly. I looked around the room before continuing. I met with my own attorney yesterday. After reviewing my father's estate, I transferred every asset into an irrevocable trust. My grandfather frowned. What does that mean? It means the assets are legally protected under the trust's terms, I explained. No one can pressure me into signing them over or taking control of them. Richard's breathing became noticeably heavier. You should have trusted me. I wanted to, I said quietly. The room fell silent again. But every time I suggested getting independent legal advice, you discouraged me. I walked over to the bookshelf beside the fireplace and picked up the folder I'd brought with me. I started keeping records. I removed several printed emails and handwritten notes. These are emails where Richard told me lawyers would only complicate things. I placed them on the coffee table. And these are notes I wrote after conversations where he insisted I shouldn't speak to financial advisors without him. My aunt leaned forward to read them. My grandfather adjusted his glasses. No one interrupted. Richard finally spoke. Those conversations are completely out of context. Then explain the context, my uncle said. Richard opened his mouth but hesitated. The pattern was becoming impossible to ignore. He had discouraged outside advice. He had already prepared legal documents before asking for my consent. He had pushed me to sign them immediately. And now he seemed devastated that the inheritance was beyond his reach. I looked at him. You kept telling me to trust you. I was trying to protect you. Then why were you in such a hurry? He didn't answer. Instead, he slammed his hand against the arm of the chair. You've ruined everything. The outburst echoed through the room. No one had ever seen him lose control like that. Before anyone could respond, my grandfather slowly leaned forward. His voice was calm, but it cut through the silence. Richard. He waited until Richard looked at him. What exactly did you need that money for? The question lingered in the room. Richard looked from my grandfather to my mother, then to me. For the first time since I'd known him, he didn't have an immediate answer. No one needed the money, he finally said. You're all blowing this out of proportion. My grandfather didn't look convinced. Then answer the question. Richard rubbed his forehead. It was never about taking Emma's inheritance. I spoke before he could continue. Then why were you trying so hard to make me sign documents without independent legal advice? He opened his mouth but nothing came out. My mother stepped closer to him. Richard, what aren't you telling us? He avoided her eyes. That silence said more than any explanation could. A moment later, his phone rang again. He glanced at the screen but didn't answer. It rang a second time. Then a third. Finally, he silenced it. My uncle noticed the caller ID before the screen went dark. Is that the same number that's been calling you all week? Richard didn't respond. Instead, he sat down heavily in the nearest chair. I can explain. Please do, my mother said quietly. He let out a long breath. It started a few years ago. The room remained completely silent. I made some investments that didn't work out. Then I borrowed money to cover the losses. I thought I could recover before anyone noticed. He paused. But the debt kept growing. My mother's face slowly changed from confusion to disbelief. You told me our finances were stable. I thought I could fix it. With Emma's inheritance, she asked. Richard lowered his head. I wasn't going to steal it. I slid the unsigned paperwork across the coffee table. Then why does this give you broad authority to manage my inheritance? No one touched the documents. My uncle picked up the first page and skimmed through it. He frowned. This doesn't just authorize financial advice, he said. It gives Richard extensive control over the assets. Another relative quietly took the papers from him. One by one, they read enough to understand what Richard had been asking me to sign. The room felt completely different now. The confidence Richard had relied on for years had vanished. My mother slowly sat down across from him. How much debt? He answered so quietly that we almost didn't hear him. Several $100,000. She stared at him. For how long? Almost 4 years. You hid this from me for 4 years. He nodded once. I thought once Emma turned 21, his voice trailed off before he finished. You thought her inheritance would solve your problems, I said. He didn't deny it. Instead, he covered his face with his hands. Everything finally fit together. The constant questions about my birthday. The pressure to avoid independent attorneys. The prepared documents waiting before I had ever agreed to anything. The urgency. The promises that everything would be easier after I turned 21. None of it had been random. Weeks earlier, when I met with my father's estate attorney, I'd mentioned Richard's growing interest in the inheritance. The attorney hadn't accused Richard of anything. He had simply reviewed my options and reminded me that my father had intentionally structured the estate so I would have complete authority once I became an adult. He also explained that if I wanted permanent protection from outside influence, an irrevocable trust would accomplish exactly that. I made the decision before anyone else even knew there was a problem. Looking around the room now, I knew it had been the right one. My mother began crying quietly. "I defended you," she said to Richard. "Every time Emma questioned something, I told her you were only trying to help. I was trying to fix everything, not by telling the truth." She stood. "You lied to both of us." No one argued with her. There was no accusation left to make that the facts hadn't already proven. The inheritance remained exactly where it belonged. Protected. Untouchable. Richard couldn't reverse the trust. He couldn't pressure me into signing anything else. He couldn't use my father's gift to erase the consequences of his own decisions. In the weeks that followed, creditors continued pursuing Richard for the debts he had accumulated. Because the trust legally separated my inheritance from his finances, none of those claims reached the assets my father had left me. My mother and Richard separated soon afterward. She later admitted she had never known the true state of their finances and had believed every reassurance he'd given her. Extended family members who had once trusted Richard distanced themselves after learning the full story. Not because of a single bad investment, but because of the years of deception that followed. As for me, I finally stopped feeling guilty for protecting something that had always been mine. Over the next several months, I used part of the inheritance exactly as my father had hoped. I paid for the rest of my education without loans. I built long-term savings. Eventually, I bought a modest home of my own. For the first time in my life, every major financial decision belonged to me, and no one else. Sometimes I still think about that breakfast table. If I had waited even one more day, I might have signed papers I didn't fully understand simply because I wanted to avoid conflict. Instead, I trusted the quiet feeling that something wasn't right. The night before I turned 21, I thought I was protecting my inheritance. By the next morning, I realized I had protected my entire future.